Hey guys, welcome back to Quick Tips. Today we're going to be talking about how to speed up your workflow when you're building mechanical files. So I'm going to say hit pause right now. If you don't know what a mechanical is, this is not the video for you. Go back to our other videos that talk about, the basics of mechanical files and how to build them, the anatomy. This is more about best practices, things that work across the board no matter what you're building mechanical for, that's going to help you to just keep your files clean and make sure that they're bulletproof. So with that being said, I'm going to quickly talk about the difference between die line and mechanical. Sometimes people use these interchangeably and they're not, especially clients. They like to do that. Hey, can you just throw some art on our die line? Oh, it's not a mechanical. We're not going to pay you for a mechanical. We just want to see what it looks like. Let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, as soon as artwork is on a die line, it is a mechanical file and you should charge full price for that. So with that being said, let's talk about layers for a second. Layers, I think, is slightly underrated. I think it's one of the most important things to do in a mechanical file. So let's talk about where you probably would start building a mechanical file, and that is with your final product comp. This is probably how you sold it into your clients. This is my quick tips in a tube that we're going to be using as an example today. The die line I've created is it's just a fake one. Not all die lines look the same, and honestly, I wouldn't recommend building your own. I would recommend using one provided from the vendor or the printer because they're going to be using what that works on their machines. So just as a reference, this is a front and a back of a tube. They're printed flat. This works and applies to any kind of shape, boxes and that sort of thing. Even pieces of paper. Die line is going to look something like this. It's going to have different variations of color, different things like that. For our purposes today, blue is our bleed, pink is our trim, and these dotted lines are just to center it down. A lot of times they'll come with dimensions. They'll have notes or have other things like that. Sometimes they'll say like front and back. One of my first things to do when I get a die line is to separate it into the layers so that I can turn on and off dimensions and that sort of thing. A lot of times they're like built on top of the mechanical or on top of the die line. It gets a little tricky to see what's going on. So I usually go in and I hit Command 3 through all the different things that I don't really need to start putting the artwork on top of the die line. So for this example, let's say I didn't want the bleed either. These are kind of more dimensional type things that could go on the dimensions layer. I'm just going to hit Command 3 to hide all of those different elements. And what that does is it builds it almost like you're cutting it, except you can cut multiple things at once. So they're all hidden now. And then I'll hit Command Option 3. They'll show them all up at the same time, and they'll all be selected already. So then once you've selected all these things, you can hit Command X to cut and then paste it onto whatever layer you want. So now it's a separate layer from your die line. You can work on the die line, keep it all nice and clean, but then you can also bring up the dimensions if you need to. With that being said, let's move on to the slug. Some people call this different things. I've been taught that it was a slug, so I always name it a slug. And this is essentially your printing instructions to a certain extent, including, I like to include the file name, what the product is, especially if you're doing multiple sizes of products. This is a 4-ounce tube. The tube dimensions, this could be just like the front facing, or it could be, what you've got up here. You could include those dimensions. Again, this is a very loose system. You just want to make it so that when you pass this off to a printer, it's quote unquote dummy proof. Anyone can understand what you're talking about. So in this case, I should probably include, okay, it's 2.5 that way. And so, maybe the dimensions are already on there, 6.2 tall. The substrate, that's most likely going to be supplied by the vendor. The finish, the fonts, all that stuff. Like, it's really important to have all of that. The inks and foils are usually where I find the most fun of creating the slug. And that's just because you want to be able to call out all the different things that are going to be on the final mechanical in a way that is very understandable. So I like to make them look like Pantone chips, even if they're, foils or whatever. The slug is just a way to keep that all grouped together in a way that it's easy to find and easy to reference, right? So for this, plastic that is going to be created out of will most likely be black. Our substrate will most likely be black. In this instance, let's just say we're printing black. So the first thing I would do is I would create, a full wash that would go to all the edges of the bleed. And I'm actually going to move my die line up higher so that we can always see it whenever we're working. So there we go. We've got our black. Great. Base coat down. So let's say I put down black. I want to make sure that if it's not the substrate, I'm including black as one of the colors that we're going to put down. So I'm just going to quickly go in. I like to keep that as a separate layer from my from my outlines there, black, white, ground. So it's very easy to quickly see that. You've got your chips. You can tell that's a 3 color, a 3 ink, 3 foil. Next, I'm going to include the foil. I think it's important to change the color of your foils so that, I'm just going to bring that color picker up, so that it's very clear that you're not printing like a gray or something that's similar. You know, if let's say you're going to do gold, gold has such a wide spectrum of variations of gold that sometimes if you just put like a yellow or a yellow graphic down, it may read as, oh, we're printing yellow because it's close enough. So I'd recommend changing your foils to different colors so it's just really clear that it's like, do not print cyan, for example. And that's why I think it's also very important to keep your product comp in the file with it. And you usually like to label it to a certain degree of like, this is a product comp, don't print it, or something like that. Again, we're just trying to dummy proof our file. So next I'm just going to add in the white, and I'm going to just show a few things. So the best way I've found to do this is just to literally copy over, oops, got it all grouped too many times. I'll usually just copy over my file straight from the product comp and just bring it over. You'll see that, and this is different from product to product, a lot of the times there will be some safe area at the bottom. You just want to make sure that nothing goes under that. Even things like descenders should never get cropped up there. There's something important here. It's for tubes specifically, but a lot of other kinds of products have these. I keep saying products, but I really should be just saying die lines because this could be for anything. This is a key or an eye. I've heard it called a few different things. And honestly, it's just the best way for when the printer is going through it, the actual machine, it's able to register very easily of what's the center, what's the back. It helps with printing. It helps with folding. A lot of times it's already printed on the blank. That's just something to be aware of. You can't get rid of this weird random rectangle on the back of products. And it's fun to look at products and see where things have lined up, especially when they've printed on like a canister or something like that. You'll see where they've lined it up, and sometimes the registration's off a little bit. You can see the ink overlap. I'm just going to quickly show, when you're putting in ingredients, for example, I like to use some sort of condensed font to keep things clean. You can just take it to, in your paragraph, you can take it to a justified centered. And then I usually try to get rid of all the rivers. So, sometimes I'll just go line by line and I'll just kind of track it out to a point. Now that doesn't look great. So then I can maybe go down and make some adjustments here, and you can go through and make those adjustments. A lot of times it doesn't rag it perfectly, and you have the ability to go in and just do it by hand to really get that justified look. So you can clean up a lot of those rivers. And then, you've got your UPC and that sort of thing. It's always important to double check and make sure you're using a size that's legal. A lot of times people don't realize that you can cut it to a certain degree so that it's still scannable. So yeah, just double check on the regulations for that. So a lot of times they're provided at the size, and so just make sure they fit. They can be rotated a lot of times if that's easier, and then you can work your text around it that way. It depends. Technically, this would be printed black on top of it, or it would be knocked out of the white. A lot of the times, at least in my experience, the printer doesn't really matter. They'll figure it out because they're going to be doing the ink separations anyway. But if you really needed to, you could make a compound path of that, and it just becomes the white. You can see I just made a compound path. I'm just pasting on the die line. So you can see you could cut it out, cookie cutter it out if you need to. So technically this is all on the white layer, but there is a little bit of black right now. So then if we're going back to our product here, let's say we had some sort of coating on the outside. I put a soft touch down, and that, we're going to readjust the order of the layers, but essentially like the soft touch would go down over the top of everything, except probably the foil and the inks. And so we'd actually move this down maybe just above the black. Sometimes it can get a little confusing as to what you're looking at, but it's a mechanical file. It's not the print ready thing. That's why we have the product comp over here. High gloss finish. You can see that I've got kind of this like my pattern going on here, and I've faded it in and out just to show that it on the product comp that it'll be a gloss finish. However, you can't fade it in and out when you actually place it on. So in this case, I've done my gloss finish as a yellow. I've done my soft touch as a green, and my foil as a blue. This again would probably be going below all of your inks. Last, I like to include some sort of notes. This is just a good way to explain, like, make sure that you're doing it's dummy proof. The printer is following the instructions that you want for how this is going to be printed. So sometimes if they don't already have it, you might put one that says like, this is the front, this is the back. Again, just imagine being someone, and you've probably had this experience before, opening up a mechanical file and realizing, I have no idea what's going on in this, and you have to kind of dissect it a little bit. This is just to make it easier on whoever's going to be opening and working with this after. So this is a product comp for reference only. I just try to be extra clear just so people understand what's going on. They don't have to double check everything or to call you up with questions. The whole idea is that you're passing off a file that should be bulletproof again. I say do not print green or yellow for finished callouts only. Maybe I'll include something else that says like cyan is for Crown 100 foil. That sort of thing. Maybe if you're confused on the substrate, substrate is black, etc., etc. You can go through and write a bunch of different things. Whatever wouldn't be covered in the general slug can be covered in notes, because in my opinion, there's nothing wrong with having too many notes to really explain things, to make sure it's very nice and clean. So with that's a lot of different layers. I'm going to talk quickly about troubleshooting, especially when you're passed off a new die line. Let's say we get something like this, and this is an actual die line that was given to me once, and they say we need to make it all, blue. So you're like, okay, great. The hard part is none of these vector lines are attached. So what's the easiest way of doing that? Well, I'll show you. What I like to do is my same method of hiding different elements. I'll go through and I'll hide all of the things that are not what need to be filled in, right? So these are just like the fold lines. So I think this was a corrugate shipper box or something like that. So all these different elements, those fold lines don't really matter. I'm going to select all the die line that I need to fill in, and I'm just going to hit Command J a few times, usually till I get some sort of warning saying you can't do that. What that does is it essentially joins any paths that are close that make sense. Sometimes it will do weird ones that are going from like here to here, and you'll just note that there's some path that's missing an endpoint, and so that was just connecting the nearest one. All you have to do is just go in, delete it, check, and make sure you got everything's got a right place to go. So now you can see we actually have connected all those lines together into one shape. So let's say we need to add our bleed. You go up to path, offset path. Typical bleed is 0.125 or 1/8 of an inch. I'm going to mark it with my handy dandy bleed. I'll send this back to my cut. And then I'll add my fold back in. And there you go. That's one way that you can get, you can troubleshoot building with a die line. The other thing is, if you have all those different dimension layers or extra things, really what it comes down to is a mechanical file is more or less a design intent file. And so, in terms of troubleshooting, when you're given a really crazy mechanical file or a really crazy die line from the get-go, I'd recommend just trying to clean it up, simplify it, make it really, really nice and simple without deleting anything, obviously. But sometimes I'll just stack all the stuff that I don't need into the dimension layer or the, extra layer. In that sense, so I can kind of hide it. I can build on top of it. Sometimes they'll have, stripes across, print area, which is great for, the printer when you're first doing it, but it's really hard to read text and make sure it's all kerned correctly and that sort of thing. We've got all these stripes. And so sometimes I'll just, cut those, paste it onto its own layer that says print area. And there you have, it all separated. It's really simple that way. When it comes down to double checking, I'd say the best thing to do is to go through one layer at a time and do this little handy dandy method, which is we've got our dimensions. I just click on and off to see what changes in between the two different things. Another way is you could hit Command A, which selects everything. And I'm actually going to lock everything that's not this file. So here we are. I'm going to hit Command A. It's going to show these two being question marks, and that's because I'm selecting a bunch of different things that are different. But let's say I'm locking my dimensions, which are type, and they're filled with cyan. Everything else should be, if I did this right, yeah, exactly, a cyan stroke. So one way to double check that you're not messing up your file is that what you're saying is over here is the only thing that's going to be on there. So for example, this soft touch. Technically, the only thing on this layer should be that soft touch where I'm specifying that should go down. So if I hit Command A, yep, that's the only thing that pops up is anything that filled in with green. So you might have, some random thing over here, but, you'll double check that to make sure the file's all cleaned up before you pass it off. So it's just one way that you can quickly go through. You can select and say, okay, well, this one's a clipping mask. So let's say I release that for a second. Did I release it? No. So I hit Command A. Okay, there's something else on this layer that I don't have already within, the stroke yellow. So then you can go through and troubleshoot it that way, figure out what's going on that I'm missing that's, extra that could get accidentally printed. So that's kind of the main double checking method is to just go through each layer and just click it on and off, right? So for example, I'm going to click on and off. Yep, that's, the only thing that's really changing is I know that that high gloss varnish is being added. The foil going back through, sometimes you might accidentally have, when you input the designs, you might have accidentally put the foil on a different layer. That won't make a lot of sense to someone when you saying it's foil, but then it's on the high gloss layer. Just to avoid any confusion, you just go through, quickly click it on and off, just to make sure you've got it all right. And then your notes. Sometimes you can go in, and I'll even name layers and say do not print. There's also this little check mark that you can go to and hit that, and it makes it italicized and it won't print. So even when you're trying to print a comp, let's say in your office and you're just trying to hang it up on the wall, it will not print that layer. So it might get confusing. I like to turn it on or off depending on, who I'm passing the file off to, but that's just, something to take note of. And then exporting. So I have, my system for exporting mechanical files. Essentially, you need to pass off 3 files to the client when they've accepted it, assuming that they own the fonts already. If they don't, you're going to need to package up the file, make sure they have the fonts and the licenses behind that. That's a whole other issue. But when you're passing, assuming that they've got all the imagery and the fonts because they supplied them to you or whatever the case may be, you're going to be doing 3 things. So first, you're going to save it, Command S, right? Second, you're going to hit Shift Command S. That's going to bring up this file or your save as. You're going to go down to PDF and you're going to save it there, make sure all is checked. Perfect. Great. And the last thing is that's going to take you to that saved as file. So this will now be a PDF file. You're going to select everything, make sure everything's unlocked, everything's unhidden. So hit Command Option 2 and Command Option 3 a few times. Select everything, hit Shift Command O to outline everything. And then you'd hit Shift Command S once again. It's going to bring it up. You'll go here and add OL for outlined at the end. So when you're turning over the file, you're actually going to be giving 3 different files, and you can put them in a folder. That's essentially the live Illustrator file with the type in case they need to make changes. Your PDF, so that anyone who doesn't have Illustrator is able to open the file, at least to view. And then an outline file, and that's usually for the printer, so that they have it and they don't need the fonts. Makes life easier just so everyone has all 3 of those files. You can deliver other things, the packaged up files, but you don't necessarily need to. I think those 3 usually cut it from most of the printers and vendors I've worked with. So let's see what else. What else have we not talked about yet? So, all right, yeah. So let's talk about my takeaways, right? Here's what was in this tutorial. Here are the key takeaways. Make sure you organize your layers. Put them in the order that that would be printed on first. You don't want your foil printed, underneath your soft touch. Maybe you do. I've done that before. But just organize them the way that makes the most sense for what you want the final effect to be. Paste remember layers is just an effect up here. I'm actually going to drag that in real quick. It's within the hamburger menu of your layers panel. And that's super helpful if you're copying and pasting from a different mechanical file, or you want to make sure that, when you paste things, I'm going to select all this stuff. And if I paste it, it's going to paste it to whatever file or whatever layer I've got selected. If you have that paste remember layers box checked, it's going to paste them back to the same layers that they originated from. So that's just super, super helpful when you are dealing with passing different, like let's say this is for the 4-ounce tube, so the client decides when they want a 6-ounce tube. You can copy and paste this over onto the new die line, keep most of your things in the same spot already, and you can just make the adjustments there. Command A, each layer, we talked about that. Make sure you include notes, because AKA we want to keep it all dummy proof. And then make sure you save separate files. And I just like to use the keyboard shortcuts, because otherwise you end up going here, file, save as a lot. So Command S first, that saves out your live Illustrator file. Command Shift S saves out your PDF. And then go back, select everything, outline your fonts, and then Shift Command S once again, save as AI. So yeah, switch it back. You were in PDF, go back up to the AI _OL. That's about it. There's a lot to cover. I've only covered just a fraction of what there is to do with mechanical files, and there's so many different variations, but this is just a guide for best practices to keep things organized, keep it clean, simple, and make it so everyone can understand them. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments. If not, like, subscribe, and that's your quick tip for the day.